Hey, there we
Hello, hi.
go. How are you?
I'm good. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I felt a kinship since we had the same expression in our headshots.
We did. Our like smirks were equal and opposite in our
Yes, yes.
headshots. It's perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to meet you. It's good to see people rolling in. Everyone watching, hi, I'm Sarah Spellings. I'm the fashion news editor at Vogue.com. And I'm here with Steve Dool from Depop. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, Steve?
Sure. I'm Steve, like Sarah said. I'm the head of brand partnerships at Depop. Former New Yorker, now based in London. So shout out to everyone in America who's tuned in.
How is it in London right now?
We're getting by. We're sort of in a perpetual quasi lockdown state. So, but the sort of biggest changes there are restrictions on how many people can meet at once, and pubs and restaurants are closing at 10 p.m. now.
Oh, okay. That's
So
kind of similar to New York. Every bar is closed by 11 now. So there's not
yeah,
tons of point in going out there.
yeah, you basically have to be sort of situated by I think 7 p.m. or else it's sort of not really worth it. But happy to support some local businesses in a tough time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's get into it. I'm excited to hear more about what you do. To everyone watching, please feel free to leave questions in the Q&A function. And yeah, so Steve, tell us a little bit more about your background and what led you to Depop.
Sure. So yeah, I started fresh from school as a very fresh-faced young PR executive in New York. I was doing crisis comms and public affairs as well as financial PR first. So it was quite far from what my current role is. But basically through that, I did that for a little bit and I realized that I really wanted to work in fashion. And so I went to work at a small consultancy in New York that also had a trade show. And so I got a ton of experience there. I was doing PR and marketing for them, for a lot of emerging menswear brands primarily. And then eventually, met some more people and a good friend of mine asked what I really wanted to do, which was, work as an editor and a writer and things like that. And so I started freelancing for a bunch of different publications covering fashion. Did about a year-long stint at Complex as their style editor. And then eventually made the move to London and found Depop through a friend who was consulting for them in New York who told me they were hiring here in London, which was great.
Oh, cool. Oh, cool. Was it hard for you to make the leap from editing and writing to brand partnerships or not so much?
I had worked and then I had exposure to so many different parts of the business, as I'm sure, as an editor, you sort of see a lot of different sides. And then also really working at the trade shows, a trade show called Capsule. That was an amazing experience to get like a full view of what went into having a fashion brand and the retail side of things. So there were a lot of transferable skills. It was definitely different. I mean, it's a totally different job, but I think a lot of the conversations we're having are kind of the same in some ways. And I think having a kind of a broad view of the industry is something that I would recommend to anyone who's, interested in getting involved. I think can only kind of strengthen your position there and your understanding.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And for the uninitiated, what is Depop? And
Yes.
why
So
is it sustainable?
Depop is a social peer-to-peer marketplace primarily. So what that means is we mostly deal with resale. So secondhand items that people own, whether it's from their own wardrobes and they're looking to sell them on to someone else for any number of reasons. Or there are a lot of people who look at it really as a business and consider themselves creative entrepreneurs and are looking to, sometimes to have very related things. Like they want to open a brick and mortar shop, a vintage store or a thrift shop, or they're interested in starting their own fashion business and they're doing things like upcycling and customization. So we're super careful around how we talk about sustainability. So, we would never say that we're a sustainable brand or a sustainable company. We mostly engage with circularity. And that is sort of our conduit into the conversation around sustainability. So, when you're done with something, an article of clothing or an item, accessory, whatever the case may be, selling it on to someone else rather than throwing it out, basically. I mean, that's sort of it in like the most kind of concise nutshell, is lessening the impact as you go by keeping it in sort of the broader ecosystem, if that makes sense, and out of landfills for as long as possible.
Right. So on Depop, you see a lot of stuff that's either second owned or it's, pre-owned, or it's been upcycled, or it's a new garment. Is that about right? By
Yeah, I
understanding.
mean, the far majority is resale, is secondhand items. More and more we're seeing, especially young people who are creative minded, look to upcycling, and also oftentimes that's more customization kind of, as a way to sort of express themselves and their kind of creative point of view, and start to build a brand and name for themselves in that way. That's the far majority are secondhand items that people have sourced through sometimes their own closets, other times through, there's a million different ways people come to these things, but it's mostly resale and secondhand. Yeah.
Right, right. And what made you want to work for Depop?
I think, there's a few different things. I think I've never worked, we're not retail in the traditional sense, but I've never really worked in that kind of retail e-commerce environment before. And I was always very interested in that. So that's one thing. And I've also never really worked at a startup, or, more accurately for us, we're a scale up. So that kind of like fast-paced, ever-changing environment was super appealing. And at a broad level, I have a deeper understanding now of what this means. But even at the time, from being aware of resale, I was really excited by resale as the future and what that means, and how especially young people are driving this whole new point of view on secondhand, and how it's really transformative in that way. So I wanted to be a part of that. There's so much kind of youthful energy in there, and especially as I'm getting older, I'm just craving some youthful energy. I'll take it where I can get it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up, because whenever I think of Depop, I think of like cool teens and young people and Gen Z. And is that pretty much the customer base? Is that who shops and sells there?
Yeah, I mean, it's not exclusively that. We're very, open to anyone who's interested in this kind of, way of consuming. But the far majority are young people. So we have just over 23 million users, and 90% of them, give or take, are under 26. That number kind of fluctuates a little bit depending on the market, but that's broadly it. So it's very much a movement that's driven by young people, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that really is what I think of when I think of Depop. It's like bright colors, kids doing photo shoots to sell their secondhand stuff. It's great. And so this is for Sustainable Fashion Forum's kind of spooky series. So is there like a fashion horror story that inspires Depop? And if so, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, so the sort of wonderful thing of it all is Simon, who's our founder. He started Depop as a way for his, he was living in Italy, and he knew a lot of creative people, and had as sort of as a serial creative entrepreneur himself. And so Depop was founded really just as a platform for Simon and his friends in the creative community that he was a part of, to have a place to sell their creations, whatever they're kind of making. But as we sort of, as it grew and more, in its infancy, we were really listening to the needs of what our community was asking for. It became this great place for people to sort of make secondhand a viable option for shopping, a viable first option for shopping. So, resale is not the sort of silver bullet to solve all of our sustainability issues in the world in fashion, but removing some of that stigma that young people are really doing around secondhand, and offering a way that's better to shop, and making it a more viable solution, is certainly one horror story that we're hoping to solve, and to make a little bit less horrific, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And not just viable, because it's always kind of been a viable way to shop is secondhand, but truly a desirable way to shop, a covetable way to shop.
Yeah, and expanding the sort of access to that as well. So if we sort of had our way, and we want secondhand to be the first option. Do you know what I mean? And at least look at that first and see what you can do there. And when we talk about secondhand, it's often like I sort of shorthand for broadly, upcycling and recycling and customization and all of that as well. We're kind of talking about that kind of bigger umbrella that you can get into a little bit more nuance with as you dive deeper.
Right, right. I think that is really interesting, because there's, in like the capital F fashion world, there's always been this really ugly stigma against secondhand clothing and buying resale and buying things from thrift stores. And I think it's interesting that Depop has really harnessed that and made it cool for young people in tandem with a lot of other things. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't think we've made it cool. I think the young people made it cool. I think we just made it maybe more accessible. But you
Mm,
know, it's this sounds it sounds so almost trite because it's been repeated so many times. But this young generation they're leading the way in so many ways. And so you know, I think there's so many things that are appealing about secondhand and about shopping vintage, and um, it's not just sort of the sort of price point that comes along with it, which I think is how people in like my generation and before used to think of it. It's like if you need something cheap, you can get it there secondhand. But it's about obviously the sustainability factor and the circularity factor is really, really appealing for young people, and genuinely so, from the feedback that we get consistently from anytime we speak to our community. But also the idea that you can get something unique that your friends don't have, that you can get something that has a story into it. It's sort of all the things that like brands talk about when they talk about their brand, like the storytelling. It's so
mm.
inherent in each kind of vintage piece that it's kind of bringing it to life in a really real and exciting way.
Right. And I've also seen that like some celebrities, you can shop their closets on it and stuff like that, which makes those really cool finds super accessible to a lot of people.
Yeah, it's fun. It makes it like, you know, I think there's a certain type of shopper who loves that sifting through the racks at a thrift shop and finding some buried treasure. And there are some who don't want that. So you can sort of do it both ways. I mean, we're definitely a discovery platform. You can go, I myself, even though I interact with the app every day, will sometimes find myself like sitting in bed, just going in a deep rabbit hole or like switching my country so I can see what they're selling in Italy or you know, wherever. So, but you can also, you know, find things very kind of accessibly easily on there too.
Interesting. And does Depop do anything to kind of foster that community? Because there is such like an engaged community on Depop.
Yeah, I mean, the community is everything. I mean, really, you know, if it's sort of baked into the functionality of the app because we're very much a social marketplace. You can like, you can comment, you can message, and even just you have a feed very much like on Instagram where you can follow certain sellers who you like.
Mm,
So if you find someone whose aesthetic appeals to you, you follow them and they'll show up on your feed. But yeah, I mean that community is what keeps people there. That peer to peer, you're buying from people, even if you don't know them personally. You sort of there's a personal touch there, you know, because if we didn't have that, we would be, you know, eBay. I mean, not to
yeah.
talk poorly about eBay. eBay, in many ways, eBay walked so Depop could run. So, you know, shout out to eBay. But you know, that community is kind of unique and something that we're very protective over, especially as we continue to grow and kind of scale around the world.
Right, right. And so because there's this kind of super close-knit young people network of sellers and buyers, what's the appeal to an established brand to partner with Depop?
Well, I mean, there's a lot. And so obviously this is kind of what I do. So I've seen how it varies from brand to brand, which is also why we don't work necessarily with brands in the same way from one partnership to another. I
Right.
think ultimately, I think it's a very easy way for brands to start to understand the value of resale and to take a little bit of responsibility for the product, not only for when it's, you know, when it walks out their door, when it's shipped from their warehouse, but what happens to it after that. And so, you know, a brand coming on the platform is an endorsement in many ways of this kind of circular shopping. So that's one thing that I think as brands are sort of looking for all the ways that they can be more responsible and speak to sustainability in a meaningful way. This is sort of an easy kind of light touch conduit for that in many ways. I think also you can't sort of downplay the direct engagement you have with a young consumer. You know, I mean, there's not a lot of other retail platforms that allow that. You can get some of it through social or some of it through if you have a direct to consumer, you know, e-commerce platform. But you know, we are very clear that sellers and brands have all the same functionality in the app, and all of that is that's, you know, we don't have special features for brands that we don't have for individuals. So brands who are really a part of the community and committed to it, they're in there, they're responding to messages, they're responding to feedback, they're looking at comments. So that kind of instant feedback from your customer is you know, invaluable in many ways.
Right. And you already have the customer base there. I mean, even in the last week, Gucci partnered with Real, and Levi launched their own secondhand site. Like, a lot of brands are really getting into this circularity space. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to see how Depop is kind of different from those other options.
Yeah, and I mean, for us, ultimately it kind of all feeds into the same thing of just sort of expanding people who are willing to shop secondhand and looking at it. So, whether they come to it through Gucci because that's something that they're familiar with and they're an existing Gucci customer, or they come through it from their local charity shop or thrift shop, ultimately it's sort of encouraging that behavior. So we sort of welcome this wave of interest in resale as a super positive thing.
Right. Well, let's get into kind of the nitty-gritty about sustainability and Depop. You already said that you guys don't think of yourself as a sustainable brand, which I like, because no brand is truly sustainable, or no company is truly sustainable. So, but how does Depop tie into sustainability?
So we're very clear about that we don't create inventory, so we're not making product. So our biggest sort of key that we have is really providing as much education to our community as we can about the options that are available to them. So circularity is the one that makes the most sense. It's what we traffic in. It's what we're all about. So that's kind of very easy, and we're also very clear about, and I think we'll be increasingly more explicit in what the specific benefits of circularity are. Because even, just as I said earlier, like, resale is not the sort of silver bullet to solve things. Circularity isn't either, if you're not very explicit about what the benefits of circularity are. So I think, we can sort of get into that a little bit more, but that's being very, very clear about that is ultimately super important to allow people to know that they're making a responsible decision and an educated decision. And I think this term, like, greenwashing, has sort of very quickly entered into everyone's kind of lexicon. And we are very cautious about not feeding into that. So, I mean, I think that's ultimately like the sort of bottom line is education and clarity in our kind of messaging as well. And then, we work on it, with sellers that we work with, individually, we always take their feedback about what are their needs that they want. Do they want some help with more sustainable packaging, since we're predicated on shipping too. So that's another whole issue to tackle about how we can do that more responsibly. So, we can help sort of, we for a time, it's a little bit more difficult now because we're not working in our office, but, for a time we had biodegradable packaging that we were able to, offer to the community as well. So just things like that, just kind of doing what we can to allow people to make the decisions that they can make to be more responsible is ultimately like our kind of responsibility in a lot of ways.
Right. And to get into it a little bit more, what specific harm reduction do you guys think about when you think about circularity? Like, what's the Depop definition of circularity?
It's about lessening impact, and it's about thinking of the ways that you can keep clothes out of landfills for longer and longer, which is super important. It's also then about, we did something, for example, just from a brand partnerships lens, we worked with Christopher Rayburn, who's, a designer here in London, this summer, where we made a DIY video about how to make a bucket hat. And so we offered, he had sort of pre-made kits for people who were not particularly crafty or didn't have a sewing machine or thread and needle or whatever, where you could buy things like that from, and it was from end of roll fabric and excess, surplus fabric that he had. But at the same time, it's also like, that's another piece around the upcycling part of circularity, where it's like, so once something, maybe it's beyond the condition of wearing it, still, is there something else you can do aside from throwing it out? Can you make a new garment out of it? Can you kind of go from there? From a brand partnerships perspective, where I'm talking to established brands primarily, we're also very conscious of the fact that we don't want to be sort of a safety net or a kind of dumping ground for overproduction, because we don't want because in that way circularity is not a solution. It's just sort of a way around the problem that's like not really solving it. It's just kind of making people feel better.
Right.
So that's also not, that's not a solution either. So I think we're in a unique time now, which we might get into a little bit with COVID-19, where there's so much excess inventory that brands are sitting on. But, in the future, I think that will be more of an explicit conversation with brands where, we're happy to talk to you about existing products, but we need to also talk to you about what you're doing next and how, we can be a part of that. we have to educate ourselves more of generally about the production side of things, since that's not our area of expertise, to be able to really speak to that credibly. But that's sort of the goal, is to be able to facilitate those kind of conversations.
Right. And what about the, I don't have stats right in front of me. I probably should, but I have been seeing a lot about this idea that as wealthier people have been going into thrift shops and Goodwills and stuff like that, it's kind of gentrified them, and it's jacking up prices as a result. So how does Depop combat that? How do you guys address that?
Yeah, that's been a conversation recently that's come up quite a bit from members of our own community, talking about it to us directly and also amongst themselves and to other people. So we work with some thrift shops and charity shops very closely. So Goodwill, Oxfam, the British Heart Foundation, places like that. And from what they've told us, and from what we've learned from third-party research, there isn't a shortage of unwanted clothing. So one study that we've cited before is that 30% on average of the product and donations that charity shops receive actually makes it to the shop floor, and then the rest of it is sent to rag houses, or wherever it may go. It's not actually there. So it's very much working in tandem with our partners in charity shops to understand exactly what we can do to help reach a wider audience for them, to have some very practical means about raising more money, for their causes and to keep the shops open. But at the same time, we're very hyper aware that resale is not a perfect solution, and we need to do more to address the problems with resale. And we'll continue to do that with our community and with our charity shop partners. I think ultimately, no matter what, we're very committed to making sure that secondhand is not only a viable option and an appealing option, but also an option that takes deep consideration to things like equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. And so we're committed to kind of working on those parts of the conversation and making sure that we can come up with a viable solution, and then also just educating people about the realities of what's happening, to make sure that everyone is sort of on the same page, so to speak, with how we're helping and not hurting.
Right, because it's no good to anybody if people who don't have money to buy clothes from a store, or just in general, can't get it from a thrift shop, or can't get it from Goodwill, because it's kind of been gentrified.
Yeah, exactly. So we're sort of following the lead of, as we always do, of our community, in terms of listening to the very specific cases around this, and then also, like I said, working with our charity partners to see their needs and to take into consideration their perspective, and then also be able to tell everyone about that, because they're on the ground every day kind of seeing this, so they know better than anyone.
Right. And another issue that comes up with secondhand shopping is this idea that you can still overconsume on secondhand shopping, just because you're buying something online that's secondhand and it doesn't have the carbon footprint of actual production, doesn't mean that it has no carbon footprint at all. There's still packaging, there's still shipping, everything like that. Do you think that secondhand kind of perpetuates the mindset that you can feel good about consuming something, and so you can kind of overindulge on it? Or do you think that that's a problem at all, or that a secondhand you can just buy it because you can?
I think it certainly can perpetuate that problem, for sure. I think this is where what I was kind of mentioning earlier about the education around it just being super clear, especially when it comes to circularity and secondhand shopping, with what the benefits are, for sure. Because any kind of overconsumption, whether it's new product or secondhand, it's all kind of feeding together if it's not looked at from a holistic point of view. So when we talk about circularity, we're really excited about people being excited about secondhand, because it's ultimately like a net good if the behavior is consistent and responsible. So we want people to be excited, we want people to shop secondhand, but we want to be extremely explicit that not only is resale not the silver bullet, there are problems that we're addressing, but circularity isn't, and all of that. It's really just about, I think, transparency and making sure that people have all the information that they need to be able to make responsible decisions as they feel comfortable for them.
Right. And you touched on this a bit before, but I'm curious, like, what are some of the things that you guys are doing at Depop to kind of further sustainability?
Yeah, so it's a lot of, I mean, I keep saying education, but it is really clear because for us, that's like the most important thing because we don't want to participate in any kind of greenwashing and we want to be really, really explicit around what we're doing. So we have a head of sustainability who joined. She's been with us for about a year now. And she's looked at, so internally, she's looked at a whole bunch of stuff that we're doing just from an office perspective about how to run a more eco-conscious and more responsible business. And then she's
Oh,
also
that's
looking at
great.
that. Yeah, and she's amazing. And Justine, I don't know if she's watching, but shout out Justine. But then, you know, and then part of that is also speaking to our community and seeing where are the specific challenges around that. So the shipping and the packaging, you know, thing I mentioned earlier around finding or sourcing for our community compostable and kind of, you know, reusable packaging as well. And then we also frankly, we look to our community because a lot of times they'll have the answers before we do. And so we're not necessarily talking about like getting into a huge fashion company and fixing something. Like when we're talking about individual sellers, it's a much easier fix. So, you know, even one example is, you know, we had one seller who talked about how she just saved all of the packages that she got things in when she ordered from Depop, and that's what she shipped her own product in. And that's such like an easy fix for an individual to make. And then she would put in a note saying, encouraging someone to do the same who she sent it to. So, I mean, it's even things like that that are just reducing waste on an individual level. That's not going to solve the problem in the world, but you know, it's a solid way for an individual to at least not be contributing to something like that.
Right. Have you ever gotten a tip like that from someone in your seller community who's an individual and passed it along to one of the brands that you partner with?
Yeah, we've talked about it a lot, and actually, sometimes, you know, it's like there are different challenges for brands because they're dealing at a scale that a lot of our individual sellers aren't. But
Right.
you know, like so for example, Phoebe English, who's a local designer here in London, she does that already with her packaging. So it's really encouraging to see how it does funnel both ways. So ideas from individuals can be realistic to a degree for brands, depending on the size of their business, and then also, you know, best practices for brands could inspire something in an individual seller as well. The sellers also talk amongst themselves quite a bit on some platforms that we enable, like Depop or you know, in sort of Slack channels that we have, but then also on Reddit and, you know, Instagram and wherever young people communicate, they're communicating.
Right. R slash Depop or wherever.
I mean, who knows? Yeah. Someone just mentioned Bethany Williams in the comment. Yeah, she's another designer here in London who's kind of leading the way in a lot of ways for new ways of thinking around sustainability and consumption for sure.
That's really interesting. I love that. I
Yeah.
need to look up Bethany Williams. I'm not familiar with that designer, but I should be.
She's great. I mean, she thinks a lot about sustainability holistically and also how it, you know, is so inherently connected to human rights and to workers' rights and, you know, and things like that. And also just has a lot of really surprising things. There was something a few seasons ago, I went to one of her shows here during Fashion Week in London, and she had used like excess material from a newspaper in Liverpool to create pieces from the collection that were, it's just really kind of interesting. And yeah, someone saying she's offcuts from other designers, which is amazing as well.
That's
Yeah,
really
it's
cool.
really kind of innovative, and also I think ultimately the clothes look good, which it's important though, because so often you think about upcycling and it's like a janky T-shirt sewed together with another one, and like, yeah, no one really wants that. So like the idea of a designer putting their aesthetic onto it and making it look really good is super inspiring for people who I think are just starting out or you know, thinking about things like this in a fashion way. If that's, we can say that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the best things about Depop is that the pieces are truly unique and desirable when they're upcycled. You can find some real gems, so it doesn't feel just kind of like, oh, I poorly tie-dyed a t-shirt and now I'm stuck with a bad t-shirt.
Yeah, definitely.
And so obviously, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed everything. How has it changed Depop?
Well, I mean, we're really, I mean, we all, I think I can speak for my colleagues in the business. We're very happy that we were able to continue to function very smoothly, primarily because there are a huge number of people in our community who it's their sole source of income or a really important supplemental part of their income. So the fact that we were able to kind of work uninterrupted as a business on our side is we're all very, very thankful for that. We've seen a lot of new people join Depop, which is great. And whether they're joining it because they were furloughed or laid off or just wanted more money, or just frankly because they were home and had the time to kind of go through their wardrobe, we're happy that they're here, basically. So that's been great. But it's definitely, I think, brought to the forefront a lot of questions and a lot of awareness around sustainability and around consumption. Just it's kind of been like a reckoning for people's values, generally speaking. I think that's a huge part of it. Taking a step back and having some time to reflect on on what your behaviors and your habits are. So having that moment has been good, that we were able to take something that's so horrible for so many people and so life shattering in many ways, and to be able to pull some kind of positivity out of it is helpful. As a business, we're trucking along. We're growing and happy to be of service to our community for sure.
Right. How were you guys able to stay open? Like, I'm not sure if you have warehouses. Were they able to stay open, or does it not work like that?
No, so we don't touch any inventory because it's peer to peer. So that was a huge part of it. So it was, I mean, we beefed up our community support team, our customer support team. And our seller team was working kind of overtime to find out where people's challenges were. Did people have problems sourcing items for their shop, and kind of working with them to see what sort of solutions we can offer for sure.
Right. It's interesting because I remember at the beginning of the pandemic in New York in March, I was thinking, like, what am I going to do now? Who's going to want to think about fashion at a time like this? And at least what I've seen in my work at Vogue is that people are still interested in it and people are still shopping in a lot of ways. Is that what you guys found at Depop as well?
Yeah. I think like I said, there've been some profound revelations that some people have had, and then there are others who were just like, I'm home. Like, how are we going to get through this? And shopping is certainly one way. And maybe that's a way to get into something that can be more impactful down the line. So that's totally fine too. But yeah, people are shopping. We've seen an uptick in interest and in sales around the world for sure during this period.
That's really interesting that there's been an uptick. It always surprises me. I shouldn't be surprised at this point because I've heard it from a lot of retailers, but it always surprises me.
Yeah, it's one of those things, I guess.
And what's your advice for an aspiring designer considering starting to launch a platform on Depop?
Yeah, I mean, I think to think about what you want to do and what it means something to you in terms of not only sort of your end goals about where you want to be from a very strictly business perspective, because that can sort of affect how you think about your shop, but what's your aesthetic, what's your kind of brand, what do you like, and just to think about ways that make your point of view unique and how you can kind of really think about that and crystallize that in a way to make you stand out from everyone else on the platform. It doesn't have to be anything kind of earth shattering, but just think about like what means something to you. What is going to sort of sustain, no pun intended, but sustain you, as your brand grows, to keep you interested
right
in what you're doing and engaged and enthusiastic and excited.
Any sustainability tips for them?
Sustainability tips. I think if you can think about your packaging and think about a way that you can do that sustainably and or at least less wastefully, that's a really good thing to have figured out in the beginning, because we have seen sometimes it takes a very long time for people to sort of reach mass following on the app, and sometimes it happens very quickly. So you can control it, because if you're overwhelmed, you just stop listing items. You know what I mean? It's not like you're in control there. But I think about those sort of logistical things. Think about like how many times do you want to be going to the post office every day or having it picked up at your house. Like, think about the sort of small logistical things, and kind of what you're willing to do that way. And I would say look at the shipping as a way to kind of make a dent and make a name for yourself on the app for sure.
Great points, great pointers. It looks like we have some questions and about 15 minutes left. So, oh wait, there's one in the chat that you might have an answer to. Do you have any brands that are creatively upcycling on Depop that you can think of off the top of your head?
Yes. Oh, no, I should have some that are creatively upcycling. I will put it in my Instagram stories after this. I know some, I'm blanking. But yes, I'm thinking about individual sellers. Is that the sort of question?
That's how I interpreted the question, but
yeah, I actually have a list in my email that I can actually. Why don't I just pull it up while we're talking? Let's do that. But we can continue talking. Are there other questions?
Yes.
I can. So I'll name some first from the UK, from the US, because that's where we're sort of based. So there's one who I've actually purchased as gifts from them before, Mind Blown NYC. They do a lot of customization. They're really great. There's another one, Avant-Garde Studios, which is avant-garde with an underscore for studios. They're amazing. Fountainhead NYC is another one. There's another one, I think it's pronounced George, but the first G is a 6. Check them out. Yeah, there's a lot of really, really exciting people. Drea from Doza is another one. So yeah, check those out. I'm glad I had this list handy because I was drawing a blank.
Yeah. Well, drop them in your Instagram stories too. And
I will, for sure.
Check them out. Okay, here's a question. Does Depop have a partner where we can offset shipping emissions within the app, either for the consumer or for the seller? That's something pretty I'm seeing more and more lately. Does Depop have anything like that?
So we don't have one in the app. We don't have a functionality for it in the app. But I don't know what I'm allowed to say, but just stay tuned. I'm not saying that there'll be a functionality in the app, but just stay tuned for comms around that. Okay. I'm going to get killed by our head of sustainability, but it's fine. We'll talk about
it. Are there ways Depop can educate their creators and customers about sustainability, such as fabrics or items that are more environmentally friendly? So, go ahead.
So our favorite way to do that is to highlight sellers who are already doing that. So we'll put them, you should follow on our Instagram page. We'll also have, on IGTV, we've been doing some profiles of sellers there. And so some of them are doing some really interesting things, but that is our favorite kind of way, because ultimately that's like quite accessible. If an individual seller is doing it, the odds are that you'll be able to, the way that they do it, you'll be able to sort of do yourself for sure. So I would say our social feeds will have a lot more about customization and upcycling, and then also about how people sort of think about sustainability as well.
Cool. So it's more of like what the sellers are doing rather than like explanations of like how organic cotton is sustainable or how recycled polyester fits into everything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, to be honest, I don't really know what our plans are around that side of things. We've usually talked about it from a seller perspective because we're not in the business of producing clothes. So that's kind of the most accessible information. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point to think about for sure.
Here's another interesting question. How do you curb items that aren't just being bought and resold automatically for higher prices, going against the idea of circular fashion? So what I interpret this question as is like, how do you make sure that people aren't just like flipping clothes in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, and this is not sort of me passing it off, but we don't see as much of that as we do as other platforms might, that are kind of more ingrained in the hype cycle.
Mm.
It's just not the preference that we've seen from our community. It exists. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist on Depop for sure, but the sort of idea of like flipping a limited edition drop, you think about that a lot with sneakers, or with when there used to be kind of like fast fashion collaborations, you would see that quite frequently. That's not the main appeal of Depop. It's a question that our team is actively looking into, though, for sure, because it is something that the community has raised as well. So it's an ongoing dialogue, basically, is what I can say from that. Ultimately we're a platform where we want people to be able to be sort of democratic, in the sense that you can, as long as it's within the confines of our terms and conditions, you can sell items that you want to. So it is a sensitive topic, and I think that's why we haven't really rolled out specific comms around it, because there are a lot of instances where something might appear one way and it's not, and we don't want to curb people's business growth, but we're very aware of the sort of downsides of that as well. And so, yeah, like I said, it's a live issue with our trust and safety team that they're actively looking into.
Right. This next question isn't exactly about Depop, but I'm sure you'll have a great answer for it anyway. How do we get those who are not already aware of the exploitative side of the industry to care about how they consume clothes?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very good question. I think, the analogy that I can sort of make is if you think about a lot of the sort of conversation in the US recently around the election, around the Black Lives Matter conversation this summer in particular, was around talking to people on an individual basis and seeing if you can change their mind that way. So I do think that's something that these kind of personal conversations, while they sort of are hard to scale, and you can't talk to 1 million people yourself, and you can't have a personal interaction with someone yourself, but you can talk to people in your family, you can talk to your friends, and you can kind of control the tenor of the conversation, and you can definitely have a meaningful interaction there. And I think that is really the way to sort of change hearts and minds, is to look for places in your own immediate circles and in your own life where you can make an impact. That's what I would say there. I would just say, like, you can find out information around those numbers. It's readily available online. So I would say just like kind of arm yourself with some persuasive facts and go from there.
Right. And let, the businesses figure out like the structural
Well,
problems.
yeah, I mean, yeah, to be honest with you too, though, that is the really great thing about social media. I mean, this is not like a particularly profound idea, but apply pressure. If you see a company doing something that you don't like, you can talk to them on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok, wherever it may be, and you can make a change in that way. But you have to sort of use the voice that you have and the platform that you have, no matter how small it is, whether that's interpersonal relationships or just tweeting at a brand every day until they pay attention to you. If it's something you feel passionately about, don't leave it to someone else and just hope they figure it out, basically.
Right. I saw something galvanizing from the CFDA. They released a report a couple of days ago, and it said that consumers are kind of caring more about sustainability than a lot of brands, and they're pushing the brands, in a sense, to be more sustainable as they go along. So,
yeah,
well done, everyone that's pushing brands.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see that particular report, but I think even like in the I think we've already seen in the last 5 years, let's say, that sustainability expectations have gone from sort of a nice to have to a must have, or some sort of like real sustainability messaging. So, that's from consumer pressure. That's not from brands, like for the most part. Obviously there are brands that are very kind of progressive in this regard, but for the most part, that's not like brands being altruistic and you know what I mean, or like doing something for the greater good. It's because the consumer demands it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I feel like every time it does kind of feel like you're sending something off into the void, but clearly it's making a difference as well.
Yeah. And yeah, you have to kind of keep up the good fight, so to speak.
Ooh, I love this question. What's the men's to women's ratio on Depop, and how can we get more men and menswear designers involved in sustainable fashion?
That is a great question. That's a really good question, actually. So the first part, it's not quite 50-50. We have more shoppers who identify as female on the platform or as women on the platform than we do men. So yeah, I mean, that's why that is I don't think it has to do with the fact that one segment of consumer is more interested in secondhand shopping. I think it probably we see most growth through word of mouth. So that's probably the most logical kind of explanation, just because that's how we know more people find the app through word of mouth than any other platform. How do we get more menswear designers interested in it? I mean, look, you have to vote with your wallet, so to speak. If you find a menswear designer who's doing something good, whether it's they're making strides like a Christopher Rayburn and they're being really innovative in the space, or whether it's there's someone like a Noah, like, you know, who's just very transparent around exactly what their sustainability proposition is, support those businesses if you can. I think that's going to ultimately make the, you know, will sort of turn the tides, you know, more than anything else. I think, you know, ultimately you can be sort of an activist consumer, and that's really empowering. And, you know, if you really believe in something, you find a brand who's open and transparent about what they're doing, and it matches up with your expectations and your hopes, you know, you can support them and tell your friends about them. And hopefully the idea is that they would be too big to ignore or too successful to ignore, whatever that looks like, you know? So yeah, support the homies.
Simple as that. Is there any benefit from buying secondhand or upcycled clothes instead of ones that are made of recycled or sustainable materials? I think this is an area of sustainability that's very confusing for a lot of people. So I love this question. Thank you for whoever wrote it in.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I work in this space, and I'm still sometimes confused about what these terms mean from brand to brand. And that's because there isn't, you know, an industry standard for what sustainability means. I think to say which is less or more impactful, you'd have to sort of dive in. To say that definitively, you'd have to kind of dive in and really look at like how things are produced, and it's not easy for a consumer to do. What I would say is when you're looking at something that's recycled or upcycled, you can just, you know, look at what that actually means, and look at also what percentage of it is from recycled fabric or recycled material. Ask those sorts of questions. So that might not answer it in terms of whether it's better to buy that versus something that's secondhand, but it may at least give you a better picture of what you're actually supporting. And then also think about like, what else is the brand that's making recycled items making? Is the recycled portion of their output very small? Or is it actually something that's been, you know, integrated into the wider business, into the wider product that they make?
Right. And I always, whenever I think about this kind of question, I always go back to something that Celine Simon told me in an interview a couple of years ago about think about what your end goal is and what your values are, and try to find brands or platforms that align with that specifically.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, there's always going to be some footprint in some way if you're talking about clothing, particularly clothing production. So think, you know, if there's something to be said for something that is made, you know what I mean, that's already out there, as opposed to something that's being made new.
Right.
But like we talked about already, that's not like the whole picture necessarily, but it is a consideration I think that you can make.
Right, absolutely. Well, we're kind of getting close to the end, but I just wanted to wrap with hopefully a hopeful question. What's inspiring you right now? What's kind of giving you hope in these kind of dark times?
You know, my nice stiff drink at the end of the day is inspiring, but I think really what's, you know, and I'm aware that this sounds like me towing the company line in a very real way, but like young people are really inspiring. And I'm also aware of how that makes me sound like I'm not young, which I reject that notion, but it's, like they are, you know, I mean, I do a lot of this kind of stuff, like speaking and I'll find, make kind of contact, or sellers will reach out to me on social media or whatever. And just to see the sort of like, the fact that no one's waiting anymore. They're not waiting for an invitation to be a designer or to start a fashion business. They're not looking for approval. They don't really care about this notion of traditional gatekeepers. I mean, that is like so deeply empowering and inspiring. And as someone who sort of had a very circuitous path toward where I am today, a lot of it, I can see now in hindsight, was sort of waiting for permission to do what I ultimately wanted to do. So the fact that there are people who straight out of school or while they're in school feel like there's a way that they can bypass all of that is amazing. It's really great.
Yeah.
I love the person who just commented, is this a business meeting? In some ways it is. You know what I mean?
In some ways it is.
Yes.
Well, given that it must be almost 10 p.m. in London, you can pour yourself that stiff drink now.
Thank you. I will. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you
know what?
so much, Steve, for
I don't need to ask for permission to do that either. So there you go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for all your insights and your expertise. It was great to get to talk to you for a little bit. And thank you, everyone, for all of your awesome questions.
Thanks, everyone.